Good evening, back here with another story today. And this is a story by Rudyard Kipling from his compilation called Plain Tales from the Hills. And this story is called Yoked with an Unbeliever. Yoked, Y-O-K-E-D, means you yoke two cows to the plow or two bulls to the plow, yoked to an unbeliever. So I'll read it for you, and it's quite a short one, and maybe it'll be of great interest. It starts: when the Gravesend tender left the P&O steamer for Bombay and went back to catch the train to town, there were many people in it crying. Now let me explain this Gravesend tender. That's a tender is a small boat or whatever is the carrier, and Gravesend is the location of a name of a location. It says Gravesend. This P&O is the shipping company which used to or have the full monopoly of shipping, carrying passengers, freight, and cargo and everything between India, Bombay, and London. So P&O Lines was very important, very large company, and they had a monopoly because the British ruled India, and India had lots of things to be transported, and particularly P&O used to be the main carrying liner for the personnel, the staff, officers, and the sepoys, which the British needed. So the P&O steamer was leaving for Bombay. So the Gravesend tender would carry people from the shore at London to or the Thames River, wherever, to the P&O steamer. And P&O steamer will sail from London to Bombay. So when that Gravesend tender left the P&O steamer for Bombay and went back to catch the train to town, there were many people crying in it. But the one who wept most and most openly was Miss Agnes Later. She had reason to cry because the only man she ever loved or ever could have loved, so she said, was going out to India. And India, as everyone knows, is divided equally between jungle, tigers, cobras, and cholera and sepoys. So this is the image the English people had about India. So India means jungle, India means tigers, India means cobras, India means cholera, India means sepoys. So this Agnes later was crying because the only man whom she loved or she could ever love was going away to India in that P&O steamer. His name was Paul Garron, Phil Garron. Phil Garron was leaning over the side of the steamer in the rain, and he felt very unhappy too. But he did not cry. He was sent out to tea. This is what the English people referred it as. Phil Garron was sent out to tea. He was employed by the company, and then he was told, you have to get onto the ship and go to India to be in a tea plantation as a manager. So he was going out to tea. What tea meant, he had no idea at all. but fancied that he would have to ride on a prancing horse over hills covered with tea vines and draw a sumptuous salary for doing so. So this is his own imagination, visualization that he would be on a horse and prancing around in a tea plantation and draw a fat salary. The only relevant things: horse, having fun, tea plantation, and fancy salary, fat salary, a sumptuous salary, what it says. And he was very grateful to his uncle for getting him the berth. See, this is what used to happen in all those years of British rule over India. Little young boys just out of school or college would be sent because the uncle or a father or somebody had influence in the company, and the British company would send the boy to India to become a manager. And the boy would know nothing, and he would come here just because he had a white skin. He would go to India as a Englishman who was always the boss because he had a white skin. So, and they would go and manage tea plantations. Now, what is tea plantation, how to do it, etc., he doesn't know because he hasn't even heard the word tea before. And so he will obey orders of his bosses, and for that he would be paid a very sumptuous salary. He was really going to reform all his slack, shiftless ways, save a large portion of his magnificent salary yearly, and in a very short time he would return to marry Agnes later. So this is what Phil Garron had in mind. He was in love with Agnes later. Agnes later was in love with him. She was on the shore and she was crying, and he was on the ship and he was imagining himself doing all this, that he would save a large portion of his magnificent salary yearly, and in a very short time return to marry Agnes later. Phil Garron had been lying loose on his friend's hands for 3 years, and as he had nothing to do, he naturally fell in love. So you can imagine that he had just had the basic education and had nothing to do. So for 3 years he was just hanging around with his friends, and he had fallen in love because he had nothing else to do. And he was very nice, but he was not strong in his views and opinions and principles. And though he never came to actual grief, his friends were thankful when he said goodbye and went out to this mysterious tea business near Darjeeling. So then they were happy that he got a job and he was going away to India to take the ship to Darjeeling. Darjeeling is where the tea business was. They said, "God bless you, dear boy, let us never see your face again," or at least something to that effect. When he sailed, he was very full of great plans to prove himself several hundred times better than anyone had given him credit for, because he had been a no good, useless fellow in England. And now that he was given this chance, he imagined that he would become a much better man, several hundred times better than anyone had imagined he could become. And he would work like a horse and triumphantly marry Agnes later. He had many good points besides his good looks, his only fault being that he was weak, the least little bit in the world weak. The only fault that he was weak, the least little bit in the world weak. He was very weak. He had as much notion of economy as the morning sun. And yet, so the morning sun has no sense of economy because the morning sun doesn't last longer than around 10 o'clock. By then it becomes hot and it's a day. So the morning sun is not aware of it. So he had no notion of economy as the morning sun. And yet you could not lay your hand on any one item and say, herein Phil Garren is extravagant or reckless. He had no major fault as such, nor could you point out any particular vice in his character, but he was unsatisfactory and as workable as putty. So he had no fixed notions or clear set rules. He was easily pliable and he could be moved by somebody's opinion. Somebody says, do this, this should be done, this is bad, that is good. You just accept what somebody says and would do accordingly. And he was like putty. You know, putty is that clay which you use for molding and for children use for toys. So, Agnes later, oh yeah, that is the putty. Removable mounting putty. That is. So Agnes later went about her duties at home. Her family objected to the engagement with red eyes, while Phil was sailing to Darjeeling, a port on the Bay of Bengal, as his mother used to tell her friends. They used to call the Bay of Bengal as the Bengal Ocean. There's no such thing, but that's the little they knew about India. And her family objected to the engagement with red eyes while Phil was sailing to Darjeeling. As his mother, he was popular enough on board ship, made many acquaintances and a moderately large liquor bill, and went off and sent off huge letters to Agnes later at each port. Agnes later is the name of the girl, and at each port he would send letters. Then he fell to work on his plantation somewhere between Darjeeling and Kangra. Kangra is another hill station up in the Himalayas, and there used to be a kingdom there, and there's a huge fort there. So we have been there, and it's a huge fort and very difficult to be breached, and it goes higher up into the mountain, and it's very well located. We have been there as one of the as it's one of the tourist spots or one of the old memories of India. So his job was somewhere between Darjeeling and Kangra. Those are all mountain spots, and tea grows in those high mountains where the weather and the climate, the monsoon, everything is very appropriate for the tea plantation. So he was going to be there, and though the salary and the horse and the work were not quite all he had fancied, he succeeded fairly well and gave himself much unnecessary credit for his perseverance. So he did do well, and he praised himself, patted himself on his back that he had done very well, and etc. Now, in the course of time, as he settled more into collar, that is when he settled into his job, like a horse is yoked to the vehicle. So there's a collar and which is put around its neck, and it is tied to the vehicle. So it becomes discipline to run that, to pull that vehicle. Like that, he became settled into collar, means he got used to doing his job there. And his work grew fixed before him. Then, in course of time, the face of Agnes later went out of his mind and only came when he was at leisure. Whenever he had nothing else to do, sometimes he would remember her, which was not often. He would forget all about her for a fortnight and remember her with a start, like a schoolboy who has forgotten to learn his lesson. She did not forget Phil because she was of the kind that never forgets. Only another man, a really desirable young man, presented himself before Mrs. Later. That must be the mother of this girl. And the chance of marriage with Phil was as far off as ever. And his letters were so unsatisfactory. And there was a certain amount of domestic pressure brought to bear on the girl. And the young man really was an eligible person. And as incomes go, he was very eligible. And the end of all things was that Agnes married him and wrote a tempestuous whirlwind of a letter to Phil in the wilds of Darjeeling and said she should never know a happy moment till all the rest of her life, which was a true prophecy. So she was pressurized by her parents to marrying another very eligible guy who had a good income and a good standing. And then she wrote to this Phil, what's his name? Phil Garron, saying, "Oh, I will not have any happiness in this life for the rest of my life." And it was a true prophecy. Prophecy means foretelling what will happen in the future. Phil received that letter and held himself ill-treated. He felt that this was unfair. This was 2 years after he had come out. But by dint of thinking fixedly of Agnes later and looking at her photograph and patting himself on the back for being one of the most constant lovers in history, and warming to the work as he went on, he really fancied that he had been very badly used. He sat down and wrote one final letter, a really pathetic word, a really pathetic world without end. Amen. And sad letter, explaining how he would be true till eternity, and that all women were very much alike, and he would hide his broken heart, etc., etc. But if at any future time he could afford to wait, etc., etc., unchanged affections, return to her old love. He wrote 8 closely written pages as a reply to that. But an ordinary physician who knew the state of Phil's real feelings, not the ones he rose. It's all cumbersome prose. It doesn't read well. Phil paid for the postage and felt every word he had written for at least 2 days and a half. It was the last flicker before the light went out. So he wrote a very long and very bad and very sad letter to the girl, saying he was sad and heartbroken, but he would wait for her and all that. And it cost a lot more money in postage. He paid the postage and sent the letter off. The letter made Agnes later very unhappy, and she cried and put it away in her desk and became Mrs. Somebody Else for the good of her family, which is the first duty of every Christian maid. Phil went his ways and thought no more of his letter, except as an artist thinks of a neatly touched-in sketch. His ways were not bad, but they were not altogether good until they brought him across Dunmaya, the daughter of the Rajput ex-Subedar Major of the army. So in the Indian army, there was a Rajput Subedar Major, and that Subedar Major had a daughter whose name was Dunmaya. So this Phil saw her. Then what happened? The girl had a strain of hill blood in her, and like hill women, was not a woman who has secluded herself or a woman who lives behind the veil. Where Phil met her or how he heard of her does not matter. She was a good girl and handsome, and in her way very clever and shrewd, though of course a little hard. It is to be remembered that Phil was living very comfortably, denying himself no small luxury, never putting by a penny, very satisfied with himself and his good intentions, was dropping all his English correspondence one by one and beginning more and more to look upon India as his home. Some men fall this way and they are of no use afterwards. The climate where he was stationed was good, and it really did not seem to him that there was any reason to return to England. He did what many planters have done before him. That is to say, he made up his mind to marry a hill girl and settle down. He was 27 years old then, with a long life before him, but no spirit to go through with it. So he married Dunmaya by the forms of the English church. So he had a Christian church marriage with Dunmaya, the daughter of the Subedar Major of the Indian Army. And some fellow planters said he was a fool, and some said he was a wise man. Dunmaya was a thoroughly honest girl, and in spite of her reverence for an Englishman, had a reasonable estimate of her husband's weaknesses. She managed him tenderly and became, in less than a year, a very passable imitation of an English lady in dress and carriage. It is curious to think that a person from the hills, after a lifetime's education, he remains a hillman. But the hill woman, in 6 months, became absolute master of all the etiquette and manners to become an English woman. There was a coolie woman once, but that's another story. Dunmaya dressed by preference in black and yellow and looked good in the black and yellow. Meantime, Phil's letter lay in Agnes Later's desk, and now and again she would think of poor, resolute, hard-working Phil among the cobras and tigers of Darjeeling, toiling in the vain hope that she might come back to him. Her husband was worth 10 Phils, except that he had rheumatism of the heart. So this girl, Agnes, got married to the guy, and that guy had rheumatism of the heart. 3 years after he was married, and after he had tried Nice and Algeria for his complaint, those in the colonial days they could go travel all over the place, all over the world, and get treatment. So that her husband, what was his name, who had heart disease, went to Nice, and he went to Algeria and tried various treatments. Then he went to Bombay, where he died. And that set Agnes free. Being a devout woman, she looked to his death and the place of it as a direct interposition of Providence. And when she had recovered from the shock, she took out and reread Phil's letter with the etc., and the big dashes and the little dashes, and kissed it several times. No one knew her in Bombay. She had her husband's income, which was a large one, and Phil was close at hand. It was wrong and improper, of course, but she decided, as heroines do in novels, to find her old lover, to offer him her hand and her gold, and with him spend the rest of her life in some spot fit for far from unsympathetic souls. She sat for 2 months alone in Watson's hotel, elaborating this decision, and the picture was a pretty one. Then she set out in search of Phil Garron, assistant on a tree plantation with a more than usually unpronounceable name. The tea plantation had an unpronounceable name, but his name was Phil Garron. So she found him. She spent a month over it, for his plantation was not in the Darjeeling district at all, but it was nearer Kangra. Phil was very little altered, and Dunmaya was very nice to her. Now, the particular sin and shame of the whole business is that Phil, who really is not worth thinking of twice, was and is loved by Dunmaya, and more than loved by Agnes, the whole of whose life he seems to have spoilt. First of all, Dunmaya is making a decent man of him, and he will ultimately be saved from perdition through her training, which is manifestly unfair. So this is a short story of how Dunmaya reformed Phil, and Agnes went after him, and again she was trying to capture him. That is the story of Yoked with an Unbeliever in this compilation. I hope you like that story. It gives us a little picture or vignettes of how life in those days, it was around 100 to between 150 to 100 years, 150 years, 200 years ago. When the British ruled India, India was a colony, and the British people would buy up huge acres of land in the Himalayas to grow tea plantations, which used to provide a lot of income for them. And they would employ local boys to send them over to India to manage the tea plantation. Managing a tea plantation required hardly any skill, because the local tea growers knew how to manage the plants and how to harvest and how to store it and all, and the machinery for processing the tea was all mechanical, and it was done by technical people. And the boys would be paid very fat salaries because they are from from England, and they could be given orders which they will follow. Those days are over now, but this is a short story for your just entertainment. I hope you liked it. Thank you. Bye.